Oh, excuse me, I'm told you can't hear me. Okay, tonight we're gonna range this discussion. It's gonna be broad-ranging, but we're gonna start with the internal situation in Taiwan, and then we're gonna move to the region and the United States and a more broader look. So let me start. I'm gonna start with Shelley, since we want to make sure the technological equipment is working. Shelley, I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. I keep wanting to look up at that screen and it doesn't have your picture. Oh, there it is.
Yeah,
okay,
it's
great.
really just as well that it doesn't have my picture.
Okay, great. Well, Shelley, can you discuss what do you think accounts for the electoral outcome in this particular case? The big side victory, retention of the legislative majority for the DPP, albeit a little less, and the split in the party slate voting.
Sure. The really amazing thing about this election is that a year ago, no one would have predicted this outcome. Tsai was extremely low in the polls and just really facing a very steep path to re-election. But a couple things changed over the course of the year. Does this sound okay? Eli, give me the thumbs up if I'm okay. He's not giving me the thumbs up. Okay. So the first thing that happened was in the immediate aftermath of a big defeat back in November, the DPP made a lot of changes. So that's Tsai's party, Tsai's administration. They brought in new personnel. They brought in some new policy initiatives. So, it's not like she did nothing to earn this recovery. But the other big thing that happened was the tension in the election turned from domestic issues, which had really favored the opposition, toward cross-strait relationship with the PRC in a way that really went well towards Tsai. The first sign that shift was happening came on New Year's Day, and Xi Jinping made a speech about Taiwan policy that a lot of Taiwanese were disappointed by because it showed no evidence of stability. And Tsai immediately answered that speech with a pretty strong statement of her own that gave a lot of Taiwanese voters a sense that, oh gosh, she's going to stand up to Beijing. So that was the first thing that happened. And then following on that, a few months later, came the Hong Kong protests. And the Hong Kong protests attracted enormous close attention in Taiwan. And a lot of people looked at it and said, if we are not careful, we will become vulnerable to PRC pressure in a way that could lead us into a similar situation. And so I think it was the combination of those factors that brought Tsai Ing-wen sort of back into the leading position. It certainly helped that her opponent ran a really disappointing campaign for reasons I'm sure we'll talk about. But I think we can see in the mixed result, especially the party list voting, that many voters said, I got to vote for Tsai Ing-wen, but not necessarily send a strong endorsement to the DPP. So I'll leave it there.
Would one of our other panelists like to talk about that issue as well?
So I think I agree with Shelley on the external two factors. The external environment in this election generally favored the DPP. I will add one more factor, which is that in contrast to the Ma Ying-jeou administration from 2008 to 16, which tried to maintain a simultaneous engagement policy with the United States and China, mainland China. In Washington, the policy toward Beijing has become tougher. There has been a reassessment of the relationship with China. So that kind of simultaneous engagement becomes a little bit untenable, and Tsai Ing-wen administration had from the beginning adopted a more pro-US policy. So I think this even though officially Washington did not express a preference, I think it held Tsai. Then domestically, there's one other reason that accounts for the outcome, which is that in contrast to the DPP, which settled the elite conflict very early and decisively, the KMT went through a protracted period of intra-party conflict, starting with Han Kuo-yu himself. This is the man who won the 2018 mayoral election in Kaohsiung, which was sort of the most dramatic development in that election, and a lot of people thought that he would just simply sweep into presidency. But then he made I'm a resident from Kaohsiung, so this is a little bit of personal. So even as a resident of Kaohsiung, I do not approve our newly elected mayor. Only so few months into the office would clamor for presidency. I think that's a misstep, very important misstep, number one. And misstep number two is that a lot of KMT old guards think that this year is their year. So they never fully throw their support behind Han Kuo-yu. So Han Kuo-yu, and also he responded, as Shelley mentioned, a little bit too slowly toward the Hong Kong protests and so on. All these combine to present to the voters that a very decisive and tough response from DPP versus a wavering KMT candidate.
Yeah, I disagree with all that. Just to add a couple of things to underscore what Shelley and Vincent said. One is the remarkable degree to which the DPP did unify going into this. I mean, not only were the approval ratings for Tsai incredibly low after the 2018 elections, but they turned around remarkably. And if you look at what happened, I mean, she faced a primary challenge from her own former premier. That's pretty remarkable, and he wound up being her vice presidential candidate and being quite loyal to the ticket. She brought back a premier who had been a premier under Chen Shui-bian, Su Zheng-tang, who did a remarkable job in his second tour of duty in that area. And some of the old guard who had essentially been telling Tsai she should step down. It really was a remarkable coming together. KMT, almost the opposite story. I think Vincent's absolutely right that there was a sense that the DPP was in such trouble that whoever the KMT candidate was, he would win, and that meant people like Wu Dini and others were hanging around figuring they could do it. And what you wound up with is an insurgent campaign that was very much not in the tradition of the KMT, and I think it remains to be seen what the fallout is going to be. But you had a KMT that had the sort of old guard types, you had a KMT that was kind of the traditional elites, suddenly coexisting with this populace that came from nowhere and was purporting to speak for the Shumian, the sort of forgotten Taiwanese, and that really scrambles a lot of the lines. So Han was able to mobilize people who otherwise wouldn't vote, and people who may have been traditional DPP supporters that were disappointed one way or another. But in this process, he lost some other folks, including young people in large numbers, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But it really is this kind of funny scrambling of the landscape. But you know, the main takeaway here remains that when Taiwan elections are fought in an environment where the cross-strait issue is salient, then you cannot afford to lose that issue or be on the wrong side of that issue. And if you look back to 2008, the DPP was, in the minds of many Taiwanese voters, on the wrong side of that issue by being too provocative to the mainland. Fast forward to 2020, and what you see is a sense that the KMT was being too soft on a much more assertive mainland. And you know, those of us who go to Taiwan elections fairly often, we're always told the next election it's not going to be about cross-strait. It's going to be about normal stuff. It's going to be about social policy. It's going to be about economic performance. And like Charlie Brown and Lucy at the football, you know, every time it gets jerked away at the last moment. That's once again about cross-strait relations. Now that's fine with me because that's what I work on. But you know, it's not necessarily the best thing for everyone else.
So if I can add, I didn't go to Taiwan. I was struck by just how ordinary the election was, in the sense that, you know, if you've been coming and going to Taiwan over the last decades, you know, it was the first Democratic election, and then the first Democratic change in power, and then the first Democratic change back to, you know, from a ruling party to opposition party. And this was just another election, and you could be talking about an election in any other Democratic state. It was really impressive to me by just how ordinary the democratic process is in Taiwan. I think it's worth remembering that.
That's really interesting. One of the other things that a lot of commentators have noted is the changing identities of the two parties. And some saying that, well, it depends on who's talking, that one party bears more of a resemblance to our own GOP here in the country and the other more of the Democrat. But Shelley, maybe you'd like to talk about that.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. The DPP, the name of the DPP is the Democratic Progressive Party, yet it's not very progressive, at least on the economic agenda. Taiwan's signature social welfare program, its national health insurance, was created by the KMT when they were in power. And the DPP has always been sort of claimed a progressive mantle, but boasts of cutting taxes and, you know, doing a lot of pro-business things that we would generally associate with a more conservative viewpoint. So this election seemed for a moment to offer the opportunity almost for the parties to switch position, because the KMT candidate, Han Kuo-yu, had mobilized this kind of working class and lower middle class coalition of voters who were very excited about him because they felt like he really understood their situation. He wasn't necessarily proposing, you know, social democratic solutions to their problems, but at least he was talking about, and in an authentic way, the economic challenges they were facing. But I think it's going to be very difficult because Taiwan is a very pro-business society. Its economic success has been completely rooted in entrepreneurship, small and medium-sized enterprises, some of which have grown in the last 20 years, mainly through their ability to outsource production to the mainland into very large enterprises. And I think most people are pretty cagey about the idea of, you know, voting in higher taxes or more severe redistributive measures. So I don't know whether we're going to see a kind of shift, but I think it's needed because there is a growing inequality in Taiwan and increasing pressure for some kind of relief for ordinary citizens, as the owners of businesses seem to just be, you know, racing into the stratosphere and leaving everyone else behind.
Thanks, Shelley.